Hello and welcome to today's webinar on dealing with the unusual and beyond, how to cope with threats arising from COVID-19. I'm just going to run through a few housekeeping bits before I hand over to our moderator, Dave Duke. Before we go into today's session, I just wanted to let you know that it's best to access the webinar via Chrome and Firefox. Unfortunately, if you are logged in via Internet Explorer, then you might not be able to access all the features, such as the chat, as IE is not optimized for this stream. During the webinar, do please ask any questions via the chat or the questions tab. We will be monitoring this and then we will ask our presenters to answer these at the end of the webinar. If we do happen to run out of time and don't get around to your question, don't worry. Any unanswered questions will be answered post-webinar. After the webinar, we are going to make a link to the recording available, plus any questions and answers typed up. These will be circulated to you after and also placed on our website. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Dave Duke.
Thanks, Michelle. Well, look, glad you could join us. Without putting pressure or wanting to put pressure on the speakers, it's 23 degrees outside and people are working from home. Even I can hear the kids in the paddling pool next door. So we'll do our best to make sure that what we provide for you in the next hour is well worth connecting to your laptops for. And for those of you who are outside, well done for making the most of the new normal is what I say to you. So look, in terms of what we want to talk about today, I'm really proud to have an expert health division, an expert cybersecurity division, amongst other areas, that really talk to each other. And actually, that's important at this time because there are aspects of our understanding and our work in health that feed in really closely to the cyber and to the wider world and operation of business and providing public service. So we're going to look to bring some of those aspects together for you, starting off by looking at the health context, moving forward to look at the cybersecurity threats in the context of the insight we have from our health partners, and then moving through to some examples of how things have been put into practice. Now, there's quite a lot to talk about. So this is the first of a series of webinars that we'll be running. But as I say, for today, we're going to focus on the health outlook and some of the cyber threats. So look, you've had enough of me talking already, so I'd like to introduce the speakers, our subject matter experts. We've got Ian Carr, a director from our GemServe Health Division. Ian, I don't know if you want to say a quick couple of words about your background.
Hi everyone, pleasure to be here and thank you for the invite, David. So I come from a background of almost 20 years now. I know I don't look it. Mostly focused on the health sector across public sector over those 20 years around digital transformation, whether it be that product or services, and laterally now focusing on cybersecurity and data protection. So in the next few moments, I'll guide you through some insights that we've seen.
Thanks, Ian. We've also got Andy Green, a leader of GemServe Cyber Delivery and a CISO for a number of organisations. Andy.
Hi there. Thanks very much, Dave. So as Dave mentioned, I'm the CISO at GemServe, and I also provide management consulting to a number of our clients, ranging from central government through numerous different sectors, including energy and defence. I, like Ian, have been working in this space for around 20 years, and all of those time focused on the cybersecurity sector. So I hope to bring you some actionable insights that you can take back to your organisations to protect you from the cybersecurity threats, specifically around at this COVID-19 crisis time. Thanks, Dave.
Perfect. Thanks, Andy. And we've got now Daryl has an interesting role. Daryl is a CIO for Blockfish, but also works for Bays, and so has some interesting insights, albeit that he's here in a personal and professional capacity, but has some interesting insights into the way that a breadth of organisations have addressed some of the things that are resulting from this crisis. Daryl, over to you.
Thanks, David, and thanks for inviting me to sort of share experiences in this day. So, as I've got over 20 years' experience of working with global organisations, including the UK government. So, as you mentioned, I'm currently consulting for Bays on smart energy critical national infrastructure programmes. I'm also the co-founder of Blockfish, which is an ethical fishing and cybersecurity consultancy. So most of my background has been around working in best practice in both technical and security roles. So looking forward to sharing some of those insights from the coalface I'm seeing in different organisations' operations.
Perfect. Thanks, Daryl. So look, we'll move through to Ian Carr's piece to set out the context in terms of the health, and this is a health crisis. Just to reiterate, as Michelle said, this is designed to be as interactive as possible. So please do ask questions as we go through, and Michelle will feed those through as we continue. Thanks, Ian. Over to you.
Thank you, David. Michelle, if you could just pop onto the next slide, please, that'd be great. Wonderful. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. So thanks for the introduction, David. So as I mentioned, I work for the health practice for GemTALK, and we collaborate closely with our colleagues across the rest of the business in various government sectors and energy, with cybersecurity and data protection at the forefront of most of what we do. So I'm going to cover some insights that we've gained since the beginning of the year, really, as we've started to track and observe the impact of COVID-19. I think we can all remember kind of before Christmas when we were starting to hear about this, but perhaps it wasn't necessarily front of mind, but it certainly is now, that's for sure. And so we were thinking of this back then, really, and we were trying to think, could this impact us, and what if it does? And it became inevitable that it would arrive on our shores sooner or later. So really what we see in the fight against COVID-19 today has been focused on the kind of immediate threat and relief from that threat. This kind of relief phase will continue really until COVID-19 is fully eradicated. But of course, we really can't wait that long. We're looking almost at a 12 to 18 month window. So quite rightly, national and local leadership recognise the need to start planning now for a recovery and a development phase sooner rather than later. So the slide I've got in front of you, we've used this graphic, if you will, to help frame our thinking. And we class this as the journey to the new normal. So we're using this to help articulate how we see the phases of this pandemic playing out. And it helps us to develop strategies to help our customers during this time of immense pressures and stresses. I'm coming at this clearly from a health perspective today, but of course it has a knock-on effect to the wider economy. So still looking at this graphic, part one, if you like, the relief phase, so or the crisis phase as it's been called. So during this phase, we've really been committed to helping our customers, our healthcare customers, through the kind of first phase of the pandemic. As you can imagine, it's quite a chaotic, highly stressed, complex environment. And in hindsight, looking back over the past few weeks, this has shared many aspects of relief efforts from natural disasters, as in protecting life and maintaining continuity of services. So the relief effort included ensuring that the ongoing delivery of health services by successfully switching even to remote working, which is important, and also directly supporting the crisis response itself through our work with the Nightingale Hospital capacity. We work closely with the East of England team there. So as we move on through the graphic, you can see now that I think it's fair to say we're coming into a recovery phase from that initial relief effort. And you'll see as you go across the top of that graphic that we're expecting a number of waves of outbreak as we go through and we manage that. So really what we have here is a balancing act. It's a balancing act between health and wealth. As the country starts to plan how to coexist with COVID until, or even if, a vaccine is found. Left unchecked, we could expect to see more further outbreaks on a national and regional level. And as I described, multiple waves of relief and recovery. Perhaps not as serious as the first one, or maybe, depends on how people respond and learn lessons. So in between each wave, again, looking at this from a health lens, you can see the health services trying to catch up. So it's an ever-increasing backlog. We all know someone who's had an operation, some elective work cancelled, so that will need to go back in. And also new diagnoses. People are at home, they're still sick, and if anything, they're not presenting and getting sicker. So you can see the enormous pressure building up in that system. We're also going to see increased mental health issues, and that's going to add further demand to a system that's already strained and already underfunded. And so we're painting a picture here, really. And can we learn lessons from the past? The last big pandemic, we're talking back in the 1918, 1920s. As we've seen there, when they came out of their first lockdown, the second wave was even more traumatic than the first. So we need to approach these recovery phases with the utmost care and learn quickly in real time. So what action does government and society take? What can we take? Well, we think more of the same, and I think we would all probably agree with that. Social distancing has clearly had a positive impact on flattening the curve. That's a new name we've all come to live and learn with. Drug development or treatment and the cure are key, but it would take another 12 to 18 months for this to come out of the development pipeline. So we see ourselves moving through an outbreak containing phase, managed based on the R number, if you will. So as and when R number increases, we'll see regional based lockdowns as opposed to larger national ones, and maybe even more local than that. Mass testing for the disease itself, and of course for antibodies, and then the mass contact tracing. These are important steps that need to happen as we move through the journey to new normal. So combining all of this information, so mass testing information and mass contact tracing information, may actually become very critical. But this could be breaking existing privacy laws, so something for our panel to consider there as well. And of course, we still have 1.5 million at-risk people who will need to be shielded for this period of time, anything for 12 to 18 months. So how can we keep them safe in their homes? How can technology play a part in creating a safe environment? Can we finally move on with the smart home? We've talked about that for years. How can we help with protecting security and data around this? We've seen examples of this recently with cross-government thinking, ensuring vulnerable people, as an example, do not have their power supplies disconnected, which has been a great initiative. And as we continue, all of us have seen positive change from the lockdown. We've seen new ways of working from home. We've used collaborative technologies. In the NHS, we've seen Microsoft Teams rolled out across the NHS in 4 days. Absolutely amazing. This kind of transformation usually takes years, and we've seen it happen in days. So we're seeing technology be embraced. Anyone now who goes towards a GP appointment will be moved towards an online consultation, or a hospital outpatient appointment will be driven towards a telehealth solution. All these are better for the service, we believe, and certainly to personal opinion of mine, will improve upon the service and make it more efficient and have better outcomes for patients. So we have all of this technology at our fingertips, but of course we need to ensure that it's underpinned and secure and safe. So eventually we will move into a building phase, and organizations will start to think about that. So we're helping our clients, we're redoubling our efforts to maintain and restart healthcare services with our customers. But we're working hard with them, actually. A lot of them have come to us and said, well, the changes we've made in a crisis phase, we'd actually like to keep them. We'd like to embed them to ensure they're sustainable, long-term changes. So we're talking with healthcare systems across the NHS. We're helping them to look at their approaches to strengthening, in particular, cybersecurity to protect services and patients. And I know the panel will talk about the threat during this time of pandemic. And we continue to have a strong voice on the balance between privacy and living with the virus and around contact tracing. So much of the new normal is technology enabled, that's clear. And as we move further into recovery, cybersecurity moves ever closer to the top of the risk register, both in health and for the wider society. Michelle, could you move to the next slide for me, please? So we covered a lot of ground there, so I'll just kind of recap where we are today. So the health system has avoided a catastrophic even event. It hasn't been overwhelmed, but it was lucky that we were able to build capacity in there. We're now moving from a crisis to recovery phase. We're now seeing immediate responses to that. The good, if you will, can be embedded to create some good, sustainable processes, procedures. What about tomorrow? Well, ongoing work. We have at least 50 vaccines and treatments in the pipeline to be developed, but of course that will take time, and we won't see that over the next 12 to 18 months. We expect further lockdowns on a regional level based on the R number, the reproductive rate. We've all learned from the media. Social distancing will remain in place to various degrees. Contact tracing at scale and antibody testing is critical to prevent further outbreaks. That's a necessity. And combining, as we mentioned, combining these two results together may need some thinking in terms of ethical issues. And we also talked about the vulnerable and shielded, how they need to be protected, and technologies are a place there to support them. Michelle, could we move to the next one, please? So the future, new operating models have changed, and there's a rapid adoption of technology, so there's going to need to be re-engineering of models. We're going to have to retrofit, if you will, security, information governance. In many cases, this technology has been deployed at scale, often with lax IG and security practices, just because we're in a crisis. And I think it's very, very clear now we can no longer separate wealth from health. A healthy nation is a wealthy nation. So I'll leave it there, and I'll pass over to my colleagues to continue the discussion.
Ian, thanks for that. Interesting. I guess what I took from that was that there are going to be more peaks and troughs. There's an ebb and flow, and societally, and of course technology feeding into that, we'll need to be able to deal with that more and more. Do you foresee that could extend beyond the sort of 12 to 18 month period that you showed on your slide, appreciating that forecasting is difficult for all of the experts at the current time?
I think when we talk with industry partners, government and local level, technology partners, even colleagues in the pharmaceutical industry, I think there's a lot ongoing now in the pipeline to give us confidence that we will certainly learn to coexist with this, if not eradicate it, hopefully within that time frame of 12 to 18 months.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Ian. And a quick question for, I guess, for Andy and Daryl, really. Having worked as CISOs for large and small organisations, how do you see the risks in what Ian talked about in terms of the combining of information and data to support, COVID-19 related initiatives? I guess particularly in relation to pushing particular types of data into the cloud.
Shall I lead on that, Daryl, if you don't mind? I think there are a number of security-related issues that Ian raised there. I think that the key point that you make there about the greater use of the cloud is a really pertinent one, because organizations, in my experience, take a significant amount of reliance on the security of the cloud provider that they're using. So if they're using, for example, one of the large suppliers like Microsoft, Google, or Amazon, then they're almost hands-off about the level of security that they need to apply. And I'll just put a bit of context on that. If, for example, they're using servers that were legacy and they were hosted on their own premises, then inevitably there'd be a significant amount of focus on the security of those assets within their own data center. Once the assets move into the cloud, then organizations tend to almost wash their hands of their responsibilities from a security perspective, relying instead that Microsoft, Google, or Amazon, or indeed one of the smaller players will undertake all of the security for them. Now, to a degree, that's true, but there is a principle known as shared responsibility, whereby the part of the responsibility is undertaken by the cloud provider, but there is still always an element of security which is required to be undertaken by the customer. And a good example of that, for example, would be authentication. So where authentication, the processes are provided by the cloud provider, the customer has to determine how robust their authentication credentials are. And there are a whole raft of number of initiatives like that need to be undertaken. Another great example is backups. Backups are often not provided by the cloud provider. So where, in the instance that you asked about, users are in often short time frames moving data into the cloud to resolve challenges that they have at the moment, they need to be very mindful that they need to consider the security around that cloud provision and apply security policies of their own. Anything to add, Daryl?
I think the only thing I'd cover really is from a privacy perspective, where organisations are going to be capturing large amounts of sort of personal data. And like you say, when they utilise cloud platforms, often they'll take good protective measures to ensure the data is sort of anonymised. However, what we're seeing a lot in sort of incidents at some organisations at the moment are where they've got large data lakes of information, appropriately anonymised, but unfortunately not segregated enough from other data items. And what happens is you can re-identify individuals or systems or organizations by joining different aspects of data together. So I think whilst people are making the rush to the cloud to capture information and often trying to do the right thing, there's a longer term strategic view that people need to take on how anonymized is information and how well are they protecting it.
It's a really interesting point, actually, Daryl, and something that I was going to, I suppose, ask based on what Andy said is that I guess there's a potential that regulators, having relaxed their positions to allow for gathering of data pertinent to supporting through COVID, will return potentially to more normal or even stricter principles. It's going to be important, for example, for organisations to consider the principle of accountability under GDPR. And for those that are interested in GDPR, there are previous webinars we've done on a GemTALK series that you can download. But that principle of accountability is something that is about explaining and showing that you've considered the actions that you're taking. Now, that's from a data privacy perspective. I guess you see this in other areas of cyber legislation, though, right? That similar type of principle.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
After you, Daryl, please.
No, absolutely. And it's that consent that is obviously critical. Obviously, we're quite lucky in sort of Europe where we have GDPR, but not all organisations or not all nationalities are culturally accepting of those rights. And so what we see in different geographic regions are different approaches to how information is captured. And when new powers are taken and new regulatory instruments are put into place during a crisis, often they are much harder to be removed afterwards. So I think from a UK perspective and the approach that the NHS and NCSC are taking to the app, they're taking a slightly different approach of having a centralised consent model, but obviously trying to adhere to sort of GDPR. But all of these aspects need that consumer buy-in and citizen consent, and ensuring that the right process steps are being taken, and that ensuring that citizens can withdraw that consent at a later point is going to be critical in buying the trust for enabling these sort of large scale adoption of sort of data harvesting for individuals' information.
Yeah, and I thank you for that, Daryl. I'd come back to a point that you mentioned in there, Dave, about how regulations are being applied currently. So we've seen, me personally, for example, I'm working with a large client in the transport sector to uplift their capabilities so that they can meet the NIS-D regulations. That's the Network and Information System regulations from Europe around cybersecurity in the critical national infrastructure. And the regulator has postponed currently indefinitely, although with an expectation that it'll be lifted hopefully this year, but certainly postponed all of their regulatory obligations. And we've seen similar things from the ICO related to GDPR. So I think that at the moment, organizations are able to, and I touch on it in my presentation, they're able to relax their risk appetite, certainly from a regulatory perspective, because the messages from the regulators are that the enforcement of those regulations at the moment is unlikely to be enforced. But that then, to your point, raises the challenge that once we get back to a normal, whether it be a new normal or we revert back to the status quo as was, that those regulations do come back into force, and are organizations at that point with their new ways of working able to meet the regulatory constructs that their industry mandates.
Absolutely, and thanks for that, Andy. Thanks, Daryl. I guess from Ian's presentation, the other thing that I took away was that where there's a will, there's a way in terms of transformation, even for an organisation the size of the NHS, the speed of adoption of teams and things. We've got a question from the audience, which I think will relate to some of the things you're going to talk about in your presentation next, Andy. There's a question about to what extent do you believe that greater distributed working, i.e. working from home, creates additional risks. And what are those risks, and what advice might be given to organisations that want to shift to sustained working from home practices? So as I say, I think some of that you may cover in your
I will indeed.
deck.
So that's a perfect segue, actually. So thank you very much for that question. That's exactly what I'm going to touch on to a degree. And my presentation is very much about the new ways of working and the new threat landscape. And then Daryl's going to touch on some of the ways that organizations, in his experience, are embedding those new ways of working and the lessons learned. So I think to a degree, both Daryl and myself will address that question. So perhaps if we can move on then, Michelle, to my first slide. So I try to keep my slides very high level, non-technical. I've just got 2 slides, like I say, talking about the working practices and the change in cyber threat. But I'd welcome any questions as we go through. So I think before I dive into the slide, I think it's worth pointing out that everybody is probably cognizant of the fact that cybersecurity is not a mature capability or practice before the crisis. And consequently, a lot of organizations were struggling with cybersecurity, embedding robust cybersecurity practices, and struggling with the increasing sophistication and the number of cybersecurity breaches. And consequently, then, really, from a cybersecurity perspective, this crisis couldn't have come really at a worse time, in so much that we now have a whole raft of new working practices for cybersecurity practitioners and organizations to have to deal with. So I think the first key point is that organizations are now more dependent upon technology. So where we saw organizations obviously are already highly dependent upon technology, but as a result of increased amount of remote working and much more distributed workforces, then technology is absolutely fundamental to all aspects of an organization's communication and operation. Personally, where I've seen this impacted, for example, is my work that I'm doing with BEIS at the moment touches on some of the work that the Department for International Trade is doing and some of the trade discussions that the department is having as part of the EU exit or the Brexit discussions. And as a result of that, where physical security was a significant consideration around the facilities that were going to be used for trade negotiations that would be handled here in the UK, as a result now, all of those negotiations are being conducted remotely over electronic means, and consequently then the attack surface for cyber attackers is increased, and the risks associated with conducting your everyday business remotely and in a more technology dependent way is obviously increased. Another key area that we see within GemServe, we do a lot of work with organizations that have not only IT systems but also operational technology systems. So within utilities organizations, for example, the type of technology that keeps a water plant running or the electricity generator operating. And where previously engineers, for example, would go and check analog dials and analog gauges to ensure that that operational technology is functioning correctly, now because of social distancing and remote working, a lot more of that activity is happening remotely. And again, that's leading to an increase in the potential attack surface that those with malicious intent could seek to disrupt. A second key point is that we're seeing security good practices and best practices falling by the wayside. Now, organizations, certainly from a security perspective, perhaps, if we sit in our ivory towers mandating that organizations follow best practices such as the ISO 27000 series, so 27001 being the best known of those, or government best practices, organizations, certainly in my experience, strive to meet those best practices. And we see to greater and lesser degrees organizations that have embedded those processes and to their benefit, that their working practices are more secure and more developed as a result of that. But alongside of that, the new working practices with greater remote working, greater VPNs, greater using of users' own home personal devices, we've seen that security practices are no longer being followed. Some of that is necessity, and some of that is as a knee-jerk reaction to just the unprecedented level of change. A good example is we've seen incident response. So a recent survey by the security organization Al-Saka has identified that only 51% of organizations are confident that they could detect and, once detected, respond to a cyber attack during a crisis. And that figure is significantly lower than the reported figure prior to the crisis, when there was a much greater level of control being administered from a centralized security and IT department and capability. The next point there, around over half of remote employees are accessing inappropriate content for the devices that they use from work. So perhaps freed from the shackles of having somebody on the desk to the left and right of them, people are now using their work devices more like personal devices. And inevitably that leads to greater risk, as threats can be far more likely to infect or compromise devices that are used on riskier sites, for example. Related to that is that users are, perhaps conversely, but related, they're using their own personal apps as corporate devices. So, for example, sharing corporate data using personal WhatsApp accounts, using social media. So where, for example, an organization doesn't have sufficient capability within their remote working facilities, so perhaps they haven't been provided with a corporate laptop to be able to work, then they're finding ways of making do. So using personal apps to share data then exposes the organization to uncontrolled data sharing and potential data breaches and data losses. And then lastly, on the fourth bullet there, I've captured that cybersecurity projects are being postponed. And we've seen that firsthand within GemServe, that in some cases, very mature cybersecurity programs that were scheduled to take place over the course of this crisis are now being pushed back into 2021. And as a result, those projects were being initiated to reduce specific risks that have been identified within those organizations. And as a result of those postponements, then those risks aren't being addressed and have the potential to still be realized. Therefore, in a summary, then organizations are operating outside of their risk appetite. And perhaps that's inevitable as we go through this level of unprecedented change. And risk appetites and risk tolerance need to flex to meet the requirements of the organization. But there needs to be an understanding of what that risk appetite is, how the organization is operating above the risk appetite, and what the difference there is, what the delta, some people might say, is, so that consequently work can be undertaken to start to reduce those risks by putting in risk controls, especially going back to Ian's point that the rhythm and the cadence of this outbreak is likely to have multiple peaks as we see other outbreaks. Understanding how much above your risk appetite an organization is operating, and the controls that we can put in place to reduce that down, is a significant step in understanding how to not suffer from a cybersecurity breach. And where those breaches are, then the likelihood of those is increasing. And unfortunately, the impact of cyber attacks we're also seeing as being more substantial. If we could have the next slide, please, Michelle. Now, unfortunately, it's a bit of a perfect storm from a cybersecurity perspective, because not only have we seen a significant amount of change in terms of the working practices that we're all facing, but also that the cyber threats are evolving. Now, cyber threats are constantly evolving, as it's an arms race, and obviously we're dealing with individuals on the other side, the black hats, if you will, who are intent on behaving maliciously, and inevitably they seek the path of least resistance to get to their aims, which is to either profit financially or to steal our data for competitive advantage. And so what we've seen is that they are unscrupulously targeting the COVID-19 crisis to their own end. So the National Cybersecurity Centre, NCSC, have released quite an insightful and relatively unprecedented alert in collaboration with our colleagues in the US from the Department of Homeland Security, stating that organizations that have been involved in COVID-19 are being targeted by advanced persistent threats, that is, highly sophisticated often nation-state sponsored actors. And we've seen that right across the piece, from those organizations that are undertaking research into COVID-19 vaccines, and also right down to contractors that are undertaking work building the infrastructure to respond to COVID-19. So just recently, we saw that, unfortunately, Interserve, one of the contractors that were helping to build and facilitate the Nightingale emergency hospitals, have been targeted. So the takeaway from that is that everybody, even those who are leading the charge to stop the COVID-19 outbreak, are within the crosshairs of those with malicious intent. The attackers are exploiting the uncertain nature of the crisis. So this unprecedented situation that we will find ourselves in means that we're operating in different manners, and that we're much more susceptible to attacks, especially those that are using social engineering. So what I mean by that is social engineering is essentially a fancy term to describe how the attackers will seek to scam us by using means and methods to trick us ultimately. So they'll use messages that come, for example, that are related to COVID-19, that will elicit an emotional response from us as individuals. We're also seeing rapid IT and organizational change, touching on the points that I made earlier, and where we have robust working practices for service delivery management using ITIL change management approaches, for example. A lot of those changes are being expedited, and to a point that Ian made earlier, that changes are being made with the idea that we'll retrofit security thereafter. And cyber criminals are exploiting those new ways of working. So, for example, we've seen examples of remote working, so where people are using VPNs and remote access technology to connect back to corporate systems. Those are being targeted by criminals. So some recent research by McAfee, the cybersecurity organization, identified that cyber criminals were targeting RDP ports, so remote desktop protocol ports, that administrators were using to set up and administer users while they're working remotely. There's been a significant increase in phishing and ransomware attacks. So NCSC recently released some statistics that said there'd been a 400% increase in cybersecurity attacks and cybersecurity incidents related to phishing and ransomware in the UK. So some of those are emails which have been spoofed, using messages which relate to healthcare organizations such as the WHO, or using social engineering methods to get you to perhaps enter your details around your corporate systems because your password has expired due to the influx of COVID-related emails, or to get you to take some action related to making a donation to a request for WHO funding, etc. And four of the most common areas of cybersecurity phishing breaches that we see are those that seek to compromise individuals' accounts, so looking to get you to follow a link and enter your details. Sending in bogus invoices related to a supplier and the supply chain. CEO fraud, whereby the spoofed email or the faked email purports to come from somebody in authority, or indeed those that are simply looking for data theft. And we saw that with the Interserve attack that I mentioned earlier, that it was targeting the HR system. So that would have been a data theft type of phishing email, I've got no doubt, as the root cause of that breach. We're also seeing significant challenges around the confidentiality of video conferencing, and that's an ongoing challenge for those organizations that are using video conferencing as the new way of facilitating meetings and exchange of information. Unfortunately for us here in the UK, the trend is that we're seeing countries that have had a more significant COVID outbreak are being targeted more by cyber criminals. So those in the crosshairs are obviously ourselves, the US, and other European countries that have had significantly higher rates of COVID outbreaks and COVID deaths than other countries. And the criminals are preying on that fact to target us. And then one of the challenges that we as defenders are facing is that residential, as users are now, all of our workforces are connecting into our corporate systems using their residential IP addresses. It's much harder now to identify what which IP addresses have got a good reputation and which those should be blacklisted. And it's far easier for attackers now to hide in amongst that much larger pool of IP addresses that are connecting into our corporate systems. So overall, it's a challenging situation at the moment. I don't want to paint too bleak a picture because there are things that we can do to resolve the challenges that we face. And I've got one further slide at the tail end that Dave and I will talk around some of the solutions that we have to these challenges. But I'm going to hand over now back to Dave and on to Daryl. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. I think in response to the question about the panel's feelings on greater distributed working, it's probably clear that we think that there are some additional risks. So thanks for that, Andy. And there's some interesting ones there, particularly around residential IP addresses. If you had to give 3 top tips to organisations that wanted to shift to sustained working from home, what would those 3 tips be?
So I would suggest, there are all sorts of advanced technologies that can be used. So for example, we've got clients that are using zero trust technologies, for example, which reduce the trust boundary down to the endpoint and are very effective for remote working solutions. But if you're talking about the top 3, then the solution has always got to be focusing on the basics. So the cyber hygiene factors. So the UK, perhaps 5 years ago, released a standard called the Cyber Essentials Scheme, which just focuses on 5 key areas of technical control. So that is boundary firewall controls, configuration management, access control, anti-malware, and patching. And by undertaking just those 5 areas of technical controls, you can reduce your susceptibility to cyber security threats down by 80%. And that was based on the research that was done on the UK government and defence infrastructure. So it's based on empirical evidence as to the actual attacks that the UK was facing, that those 5 controls would stop cyber-based attacks by 80%. So focus by patching the devices that a remote user will be coming in by, ensuring that there's robust access control and 2-factor authentication, etc., firewalls, and so on. So I'd thoroughly recommend that anybody who's interested have a look at the Cyber Essentials Scheme for more detail on those hygiene factors.
Yeah, that's a good point and a good piece of advice, Andy. And the Cyber Essentials Scheme is something that we can point you to in terms of where the government advice sits. But I know there's some quite useful graphics that kind of show you the top 10 things that you should be doing. I guess cultural aspects are also important. As we were going through there, I had a most untimely snooze/update invitation from my laptop, which I rapidly snoozed. But of course, actually going through and undertaking those things such as shutting down in the evening rather than maintaining it as on will enable security updates to go through as well. So I must make a note to myself to make sure that I do that, having snoozed it. We'll come to some of the cultural aspects in future webinars, but I want to give the stage to Daryl Flack now, our external guest, who will talk a little bit about his experience of how organisations are mitigating the risks. Daryl, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, David. So I'd just like to spend a short period of time. I've only got one slide with a couple of key headers on to talk through some of the key things that I've seen with organisations I'm working with during the crisis on how they're dealing with some of the impacts that Andy has mentioned. So if we could just jump onto the next slide, please. So supporting the workforce sounds like a really simple and straightforward aspect, and a lot of things that was probably paid lip service prior to the crisis. I think there were often lots of organisations that had individuals working from home 1 day a week, and you could get by on just having a very sort of ad hoc nature of remote working. But I think as soon as vast numbers of people were having to work from home, culturally things changed massively. And so the health and well-being of your staff has become of critical importance. So having tired, uncomfortable staff who are not being productive or efficient and are more likely to make mistakes has been a real eye-opener for a lot of organisations. So I'm seeing a lot of government organisations now putting scheduled breaks into people's calendars to ensure they get up and move around. I think obviously most people would have been travelling between meetings, having tea breaks, having catch-ups, commuting. A lot of those aspects have now sort of been removed from their working day, and they can find themselves sedentary for long periods of time, which can be very poor for their health. I think regular checkings on personal health and well-being, having team updates that aren't sort of work related, that are just personal related, where people can get things off their chest, being able to update on sort of news that's going on in their lives, as well as corporate news, and just generally looking after each other a bit more. I think people have become a lot more aware of how degraded people's ability is to sort of cope for long periods in front of a computer looking at a screen. I've seen lots of examples of people feeling frustrated that they seem tired even though they're not doing much, whereas in reality they're not recognizing that they're actually looking at a screen for probably 4 hours more a day than they were previously with the breaks that they were receiving. So understanding that it's sort of okay not to be okay in some of those areas, and having tolerance within your workforce is critical for a lot of organizations to take on board. I think many people are balancing being a member or an employee of that organization, whilst balancing being a parent, being a teacher, being a carer. So we're seeing that that's changing a lot of the work patterns that people are now having. So people trying to organize meetings throughout different points of the day, some people starting earlier, some people having breaks during the day, some people finishing a lot later. And I think we're going to see that imbalance become a real issue as we do a phased back to work process, with some people going back to work while some people working remotely. So lots of the organizations I'm working with are looking at how they can support their staff a lot more. I think from an environmental point of view, touching on what I mentioned earlier, when you're working from home 1 day a week, you don't necessarily need a desk. You can get by with sort of doing it on your breakfast bar or doing it on your sort of dressing table. Whereas when you're doing it for 6 to 8 weeks, 5 days a week, things become very different. So we're seeing companies offering to fund for home equipment, for desks, for chairs, for headsets. I'm sure we've all had the dreaded issue where you're about to dial in and for some reason your iPhone's headsets aren't working for whatever reason. So having good equipment that enable people to be productive at home is becoming more and more important. And also, we're seeing organisations already looking at their physical locations. A lot of organisations are spending large amounts of money on having physical buildings. And I think if this has taught a lot of the organisations anything, is that actually they can work from home. Do they need to invest all of that money up front? So I think we're going to see a lot of changes in how organisations structure themselves, having more ad hoc meeting places and workplaces, and utilising work from home a lot more. And I think in terms of helping your workforce, I think education is becoming key. Lots of things have changed very quickly, and people are having to deal with lots of new things. Working remotely, having to deal with new remote access services, things like Teams, things like Zoom, giving simple guidance to help people act securely in those environments. I think heightened alertness to the threats that Andy mentioned, having short targeted awareness of the key threats, how they can impact your organization and what to look to. Everyone's incredibly busy right now, and so delivering things like 2 hours of structured e-learning over the web isn't going to really help or get them to retain that information. So short, sharp 1 or 2 minute brief aspects are going to help, but little and often is the key for those things that we're finding is being effective. During these times, having phishing campaigns being run, this is the time, as Andy said, where we're seeing a huge increase, as he mentioned, 400% increase in sort of phishing and ransomware attacks. So you need to be testing your staff, but in a supportive and constructive way, so they don't feel like they've got something else to worry about. Ensuring that everything you give them is based around helping them to be more secure and helping them in their personal lives. And giving them some simple and concise information around what they need to do in your organization around specific policies. I think sending them 50-page IT acceptable use policies just isn't going to help. You know, a couple of infographics and a 1-pager max with lots of pictures on is how you're going to help people to understand what they need to do, something that they can just quickly reference when they need to. I think the next phase that we're seeing a lot on is how do we keep the lights on? Where we don't have people on site. Some of the data centers now don't have people within them to be able to do certain types of activities. So we're seeing organizations having to go out and procure hypercare around those critical systems. So identifying what their critical systems and what their critical processes are, ensuring that they have more people available to support them when they need them. And that may mean going to external experts. That may mean changing their SLAs with the existing suppliers and the contracts that they have. And it may even mean looking at other aspects to bolster their systems and additional recovery capabilities and cyber insurance. So should the worst happen, they've got an ability to recover as a business. I think managing change, we've all touched on how technical diversity has accelerated rapidly, sometimes without some of the controls in place. But governance is still required. I know with a lot of my government clients that I'm working with, previously they wouldn't even allow remote dial-in to some of their governance meetings from a security point of view because of the nature of the things that they were discussing. Whereas all of that has now moved to sort of secured Teams engagements, and actually probably more productive in many ways. So I think, as I touched on earlier, phased back to work of keeping those governance aspects is going to be critical. Some people will be in the office, some people will be remotely. How you can get those webcams to work where you haven't built that sort of infrastructure is going to be important. Ensuring you've got your change management governance appropriately in place right now, to even if you are being a bit looser on your governance, ensuring at least you're recording the changes that you're making so that if things go wrong, you've got the ability to roll back. We've heard some sort of horror stories of people rolling things out quickly only to sort of lose remote access, which right now, that's one thing you don't want to do. I think the key watchword here is at least do no harm. Do not take out your remote access systems right now. So be very aware of those. I mean, there's always that risk balance to be had on updating systems whilst not having people on site. Most things can be rebooted remotely, but I'm sure we all remember back to those days where people sort of used to remote boot a router in a different country and it never came back up and it was down for days while people had to sort of get on a plane and get there. Those things aren't possible right now. Going to remote locations just aren't achievable. A lot of the work we do is with sort of NCSC on their commercial product assurance schemes. Test labs are having to assure products, so remote witnessing of tests against these products, remote visiting to sites in China and South Asia just aren't possible. So some of those aspects are going to have to be looked at from a government point of view. And capacity. Lots more people are using different pipes at different speeds with different rates of data. So adding capacity, people are now going out and having to procure additional capacity. Installing hardware is a lot more challenging right now. So procuring it might be okay, but getting people on site to install it and to initiate it is a lot harder. So those with cloud systems that can scale out are having a bit more benefit. But ultimately, people are having to change their working practices, as I touched on from a user point of view, changing working patterns to different points of the day so that you spread the load across the different times of the day. I think the increased use of things like Microsoft Teams and Zoom is having a major impact on people's infrastructures. But ultimately, I think people are becoming a lot more productive because of it, because of the times that they have and the less traveling in between. I think for the third aspect of preparing for the unexpected, I think I've got three key areas there: review, test, and monitor. And I'm aware we're sort of getting short on time, so I'll speed through them. But it's important to ensure that when you're reviewing these aspects, you looking at your system privileges and your access controls in order to mitigate some of the risks that Andy mentioned. Looking at your distributed denial of service protection, have you got it? Can you implement it remotely? Looking at the security controls around your sort of web gateways and your email gateways, making sure you've got the right policies to enable your staff to work. And when you've reviewed all of those and you've looked at your backups, that are they appropriate? Are they in a suitably segregated place that you can test some of these things? Have you had some recent vulnerability scans against your organization to make sure there's no glaring things that you can lock down? Have you looked at your external internet facing services? Are you doing some ethical phishing against your staff? And then when you're confident that you're in a reasonably good state from a posture point of view, you can monitor some of these things. You can monitor for anomalous events, unusual logins, inbound traffic, those sorts of things. We're seeing lots of organizations now having to sort of do much more attuned monitoring to sort of shadow IT, where systems have been put in without their knowing. So lots of people are now looking to procure very quick online SOCs so that they can see the alerts that are being produced, see the ports that are going out of their organization that they may not otherwise have seen, and those that are coming back in. And then obviously, most importantly, monitoring and patching those services. Lots of organizations are holding back on some patching just because of the risks it causes. But when it comes to security patches, obviously those need to take precedence. So overall, lots of the organizations are having to change to a new and evolving world. Focusing on people is much higher than anyone ever expected and is having a much bigger impact. But keeping the lights on, making sure your systems can run, and identifying those key critical systems and testing for vulnerabilities is what we're seeing, where most organizations are taking the most guidance and taking the most effort to sort of remediate.
Daryl, thanks for that. Really useful, lots of insight there. The people piece is particularly interesting, and I think on coming weeks, playing in from some of the insight that Ian Carr and the Health Division give us, we'll look at some of the cultural challenges and opportunities, because I think there are both challenges and opportunities, as you've described. You mentioned Zoom and Teams, and Andy mentioned them as well, and of course Ian mentioned with the NHS. There's been a question coming just around whether there's a difference between Zoom and Teams, and should we be considering one more secure than the other? I'm conscious of time, but if you'd like to give a very brief answer to that, either yourself or Andy.
Andy, would you like to cover that, and I can chip in after?
Yeah, certainly. I think it's down to the organization's policy. So they both have laudable levels of security if they're deployed correctly. So it's about following the best practice that the company provides, so that you're secure in the way that you set up and run the conferences. And I would, if you're a Microsoft house and you have Microsoft licenses, if you have an E3 or an E5 license with the additional security capabilities, I would opt for Teams. Otherwise, Zoom is a good alternative. And there are others out there, but the key point is to follow the organizations, the vendors' security recommendations.
Thanks, Andy. Quick final point or question, I suppose. Yourself and Daryl, Andy, are both very well connected. You know, Andy, I know you're plugged into threat updates and things which people and others may not be privy to as a consequence of your role as a NCSC accreditor, NCSC being the National Cybersecurity Centre. We talked about a lot here. Is there a way that organisations can access this type of information themselves and access it in a user-friendly way? It maybe touches on the slide we're going to talk about around the GemServe service, but from your experience, there's us, but are there other ways of accessing that information user-friendly?
Yes, absolutely. It's a bit of a broad question because it depends on the organisation in question. If, for example, you're part of the critical national infrastructure, you're a government organization and so on, then there is a threat sharing capability which was stood up as part of the NIS regulations at the same time. So that's called CISP, the CISP Cyber Information Sharing Partnership. And so organizations can go on there, and there are forums for each of the different verticals that you're in as part of the critical national infrastructure. And then the next best place essentially is via your partners. So if you have a trusted partner for a cybersecurity partner, so GemServe, if you're a client of ours, then we can provide you with specific intelligence pertinent to your organization and your vertical. Or if you procure a service from one of the large global vendors, such as one of the Silicon Valley vendors, such as Splunk or Cisco or Juniper, or one of those type organizations, then you can get threat information from those parties too.
Fantastic. Thanks, Andy. So I know Michelle's going to tell me off afterwards in terms of timekeeping. Look, that's been really, really useful. I'd like to move on to the next slide just to keep that up there, Michelle, if we can. And I'm conscious that as time wraps up, there's quite a bit that we could have talked about. Andy touched on the fact that we provide particular assurance services. I think in the interest of time, Andy, that's maybe something that I'd encourage our attendees to reach out directly for.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that ultimately what we have is a group of 4 different capabilities there, which are capabilities that we had before the crisis. But what we've done is we've created a bespoke proposition for the threats which are COVID specific, where we're using, for example, specific indicators of compromise, as they're called, i.e. that if there is a threat, a specific COVID related threat, it'll have a particular footprint. We'll be able to pick that up within our assessment, and we'll be able to give you the remediation so that you'll no longer be targeted. And by procuring one of those services, not only do you get the benefit of stopping the threats related to COVID, but the good practices that you will embed will obviously then benefit you post-crisis as well.
Thanks, Andy. And look, we're not a firm where the clock starts ticking as soon as you call or email. Our experts are here to help. So do ask us. You'll be surprised at how easy it is to access that help and advice without having to worry about the cost. In terms of where we are now, this is a series, so we'll be running one next week on business continuity and the supply chain, some of the things we touched on here. There'll be a following one in terms of technical challenges and opportunities from the new normal. Andy touched on zero trust architecture. We'll have a look at that in more detail. And then we also look at the way that remote working affects compliance regimes. We'll have external speakers. We'll be creating a series, and as I say, please do follow the GemServe website for more details of that. There's a dedicated webinar page that you can look at, as well as a lot of useful supporting content, and we'll share some of that supporting content through links after this webinar. Michelle, I think I've just about wrapped up in time, so thank you for attending, and thanks to our speakers. I'll hand over Michelle to do the close.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you, Ian, Daryl, and Andy. That was very informative, and I hope everyone enjoyed listening as much as I did. Yeah, just to reiterate, we will be making the link available for this on our website, and what I will do, I'll get the guys to pull together some useful links that will be helpful to you that we can post as well on the website and in a follow-up email. As Dave mentioned, there will be further webinars in the coming weeks, so look out for those, and please do sign up if you really enjoyed our series like I have. Thank you. Take care. Bye bye.